Welcome back to another episode of the Uncommon Reader podcast. As always, I'm your host, Chris Doherty. We have an awesome episode for you guys today. I had the pleasure and the honor of sitting down with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Heather Ann Thompson to discuss her new book, Fear and Fury. Fear and Fury covers the Bernie Goetz case that took place in the 1980s. Bernie Goetz was accused, charged, and ultimately convicted on weapons charges for a crime that took place in a New York City subway where he attacked four young black men, shot one of the black men, Daryl Cabey, and ultimately severed his spine. Cabey is now brain damaged. This is a riveting story and an incredible piece of history that Heather covered so well. If you haven't read Fear and Fury, I will have a link to the book in the show description. You can also grab her first book, which is about the Attica prison uprising that took place in the 1970s. That is an absolutely incredible story as well. A couple of housekeeping items before we get into the interview with Heather. As you guys probably have noticed, I have not recorded a podcast episode in quite a while. If you aren't following me on social media, my mother did pass away unexpectedly on March 1st. It has been a really difficult time for my family since the loss of my mother. I miss her every day. I love her very much. I'm finally starting to get back to normal with everything, and we'll have a more regular schedule for the podcast. For those of you guys that are considering joining the book club or have already joined the book club, we will soon be starting our second slow read of the year, which is Underworld by Don DeLillo. Make sure you head over to Patreon to get the details on that kickoff in the beginning of April. We're winding down our first slow read, which is The Effingers. Additionally, if you are not part of the book club, now is a great time to do so. You can use code SPRINGBOOKS to get 50% off your first month to become a member of the community, get access to all of the paid subscriber perks and features, as well as access to the Discord community. Would love to see you guys there. No worries if not. And lastly, we have a special announcement coming later this week on all social media platforms, exclusive to all Patreon subscribers. I'm so excited to announce this partnership. Can't wait for you guys to hear it. But without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Heather Ann Thompson as a guest on the Uncommon Reader podcast. I hope you guys enjoy it. We'll talk to you soon. Heather Ann Thompson, thank you so much for coming on the Uncommon Reader. You are as busy as a bee lately with your new release, Fear and Fury, on the heels of your Pulitzer Prize-winning work about the Attica prison uprising. Thank you so much for taking the time today. We have been following each other on social media for a while. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, I know I was just talking to you before we went live that I was scheduled to see you when you came here to Pennsylvania. How was your time at Muhlenberg?
It was amazing. As someone who used to live in Philly, I always love every opportunity to come to Pennsylvania. So it was a real treat, and I love getting to talk about this book, especially in this moment, because everybody in the audience is kind of feeling this changing moment so acutely. It always makes for, not so much of an uplifting discussion, but definitely a good discussion.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for a book like Fear and Fury to come out. When you think about a story like Fear and Fury versus a story like Blood in the Water, Blood in the Water was a story about a history that was actively suppressed, right? Like this was something that you had to dig into archives that weren't publicly available. Whereas Fear and Fury was a very publicly sensationalized event. What was the writing process from a historian's perspective? Like, what was the collective process of putting together a book like Fear and Fury versus what the work was like for putting together a book like Blood in the Water?
Oh, what a good question. It's interesting because there was a lot of things that were quite different and a kind of surprising number of things that was the same. What was different, of course, is that the archival materials for Blood in the Water were just not available. The state of New York had pretty much prevented access to any of its own records. And so the 13-year journey to do the book was really about how do I recreate the archive, who has the copy of the original, who might know something about this that, we hadn't asked before. And so in that sense, it was quite different. But I will say that even though this case, the Bernie Goetz case, was so sensational, and in fact, actually, Attica was pretty sensational too. So there's lots of press coverage, and I was able to get access more easily in this case to the trial transcripts and to some of the other legal documents I was able to see more quickly. But I will say that what was similar was this kind of bizarre experience of looking at a case that everyone really thought they understood or at least knew what had happened. And then the more I'm digging, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not at all what happened. And so it was it felt similarly like excavating, an Alice in Wonderland moment where you're just like, how can the press say this when that isn't what happened? Why did people think this when that is not what happened? And that was very similar.
You have a case that, the Bernie Gates case, and because of it being so sensationalized, it almost has this like mythological sphere around it. When you're putting together a narrative, is there anything specific that you're pushing back against that, years and decades have passed since this was a, front page main story, and now in the time that has passed, people have these remembrances of what that time was like, the time that it took place in, the people that were involved. How do you push back against kind of the myth of what that case and the story was, and what the actual facts and the history of
Well,
that is?
it's an interesting moment to compare the time I wrote Blood in the Water again, in a way I hadn't really thought much about. When I wrote Blood in the Water, there was a lot of misinformation about Attica as well. And in fact, it had, like the Getz story, had kind of disappeared off people's radars. But what they did know about it was completely inaccurate. And then the book comes out. And when that book came out in 2016, as we're really on this precipice of kind of a politically changing moment, people were very receptive to the idea that you could do research and that you could find things that we didn't know, and that, one's mind could be changed. It's like, oh, wait a minute, the prisoners didn't kill all of the hostages. Oh, wait a minute, the state of New York actually is the one that killed everybody in Attica. Like this kind of thing. This time I have found it's a very, very different experience. Similarly, I am going into a story where everyone thinks that, they know the story. Some guy shoots 4 Black teenagers on a train because he's being robbed and he's being threatened. And, however regrettable that is, everyone kind of understood it because the was so crime filled and fearful and dangerous. And then I write this book where I don't deny at all the danger and the fearfulness, but try to contextualize why that was. And then to go into this case and say, but actually, no, the guy himself says, I don't feel that I was I wasn't being robbed. It's a really different story. And the pushback has been quite extraordinary, which is not to say that people haven't been kind and favorable about the book. It's to say that if you look online, I did the Daily Show and I kind of, always glance at the comments, and it's just kind of humbling to see how much pushback there is to the facts. But of course, that's what the book is about. It's about this new moment where the facts don't matter and where people's racial ideas and their imagination about why violence is necessary is now trumping, no pun intended, the the reality on the ground of whether such violence is merited and so forth.
And you bring up such a valid point. Like today's society, I think, obviously create book content, and there's a lot of folks that I talk to offline that also create book content. And my wife is a master's educated literature teacher. And, one of the things that we talk about is it's so hard to have nuanced discussion about critical topics. And when you're writing a story like this, in the back of your mind, is that thought prevalent? Like, hey, I'm going to put these facts laid out in a narrative style, and people are just going to look past it.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, what this means is at some level, I'm even more glad of what I do every day for a living, because being a historian, it's not, it's quite different than some other academic disciplines. When you're a historian, you don't get to just make up a theory and say, this is my personal Heather Thompson's explanation for something that happened. Historians have to literally go into the past and piece it all back together again. And many, many times when we do that, we are, shocked and disappointed. And what we thought might be the outcome is in fact not the outcome at all. And so when we write, the actual facts matter so, so much. And in this moment, I felt even more acutely the need to undergird anything I was saying, including even the simple timeline of what had happened on that train or what had happened during the trial or what had happened afterwards, with not one footnote, but 2, 3, 4. And if you look at anything I write, I mean, as long as my books are, the last 200 pages are footnotes. What does that mean? It means that, there's no problem with finding facts, and or not finding them, that the facts are there, right? Interpreting them in such a way, or putting them back together in such a way that makes logical sense. Yeah. I mean, it is astounding to me that people still to this day can say, these teenagers were actively threatening Bernie Goetz. They were wielding sharpened screwdrivers. They were surrounding him. And there is zero evidence, including from Bernie Goetz himself, that that's ever what had happened. So what do you do with that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe we keep hoping the truth will out. I mean, I don't know, other than to do what we do every day.
I got to meet Rick Atkinson last year on one of his tours for his American Revolution trilogy that he's working on. And the second book, Fate of the Day, had come out. And he had talked about in the book that his process of writing this story, he had access to, I believe it's like the Queen's archives in England from like King George. And they're up in this tower, and he would walk the same 300 steps every day and just sit with these historical documents. Is there any sort of like process that you go through each time you're writing a book that is just like, this is my process every time? Or is it different every time you approach a new work?
Well, it's definitely, there is a rhythm to it, and there's many ways to write about the past. And for me, it is always helpful to think about one particular iconic or representative or, flashpoint event that I suspect, but don't really quite know how yet, will exemplify the moment, will allow me to pull out the threads of whatever that historical moment is that I'm trying to figure out. And figure out is really the key here, because as much as I suspect and guess and hope and pray, you don't really know until you're getting into it. And so I start with an event. And in this case, or actually back with Attica, that, we were busily locking up everybody, in this country. We were becoming the world's largest incarcerator. And I suspected that this prison uprising had something key to say to that moment when we shifted, when we began, this event was in 1971. By 1972, we have begun mass incarceration. So I suspected that that was an important event. And similarly, I suspected that this vigilante shooting would tell us something about this current moment of vigilante rage and violence. But then it's a matter of just piecing together the what happened. And so my process is grabbing from any possible area I can imagine that will shine some light on what happened. And in this case, just like in Attica, the people I was most interested in hearing from are the people that we didn't know anything about. And of course, that meant that their stories were the hardest to find. So, it is a matter of just trying to rescue stories that either haven't been told before or were told, but nobody was listening. It's a grab fest in many senses for me. And usually for historians, there's an ability to just go to an archive and say, I want to go get box 30, folder 12. It's going to tell me something about it. In the case of just about everything I write, unfortunately, the archive is sometimes there, but only so helpful because, of course, in this case, the story of the 3 teenagers who were shot by Bernie Goetz, it's not in the archives. It's
Right.
only to the extent that they show up in the criminal trial, in the trial transcript. It's not in the archives. So you have to kind of think about, well, how am I going to illuminate this? And I'll give you one key example of how that came to me, which was really kind of poignant. I had come across in this lawyer, Ron Kuby's records, that one of the most severely injured teenagers, Daryl Caby, his mother had applied for funding from the Crime Victims Board in the state of New York. And this was a really important fund for people who'd been victims of violent crime to get some restitution if their ability to make a living had been compromised, or the person taking care of them had to quit their job to take care of them. Both were the case, of course, with Daryl Caby. And they had applied for this. And of course, when you apply for something, there's all kinds of information about the family and, how many brothers he had and what was their life and why did they need this money. So I got to learn so much about him from this just one bureaucratic document. But I also got to learn so much about the moment when I watched these really kind of shocking Herculean acrobatics that the Crime Victims Board went through to deny
Right.
that he was a victim and to deny him any benefits, not once, not twice, but 3 times because his mother refuses to accept this and just keeps pushing back. Just in that one document, it was like the world opened up for me as a researcher because I was like, "Oh, wow, I'm understanding this in a whole different way than I might otherwise."
And puts you down another rabbit hole about the system and all that stuff. It's crazy. You had talked a little bit about some of the pushback that you had received since the release of this book, and you went on the Daily Show, and that's an accomplishment in and of itself. And some of the stuff that I was reading from some of like the reviews and stuff is Bernie Getz is still alive, and you chose intentionally not to interview him. Can you talk a little bit about the methodology there and kind of why that was intentional on your part and how that plays into the story that you're telling?
Yeah. Historians sometimes will do lots of interviews. We call it oral history. It's a very important historiographical method where have the rules behind it and how you do it exactly right. And I've never been an oral historian, but in many books that I write, I have conversations with people that cross my path as I'm doing the research. And I will refer to those conversations in the footnotes of my book if they've been helpful to me. In this case, I actually thought I would interview Bernie Getz and the victims because it was such a particularly resonant story for today. And tried to reach out to all parties. And then I quickly realized that I was not going to do this because I couldn't interview the victims. And therefore, I would only be interviewing the one guy who not only got to keep telling the narrative at the time again and again and again, but was still telling the narrative, shaping the narrative. And yet the victims were nowhere. Like nobody was asking them what had happened. Nobody cared what their opinion is, what had happened. And I couldn't ask because one of them that was surviving was brain damaged and, paralyzed. The other only surviving victim had basically kind of removed himself from the public sphere because he remained so traumatized from all of the experience. So that kind of decided it for me. I needed this to be as balanced as it could be. And therefore, that meant going back to the actual records at the time.
Hindsight's always 2020. If this is kind of off the cuff question as I'm listening to you speak, if you had an opportunity to sit down with Bernie Getz and ask him a question, is there anything particular that you would want to know from his point of view, or is
No.
nothing really standing out? Right.
No, but again, that's not because I'm being stubborn about this. It's actually because he spoke so, so, so much
Mhm.
about this event. He gave a 2-hour lengthy confession about why he did what he did at the time. He actually gave a multiple lengthy confessions. One of them was videotaped and one of them was recorded. He explained what he did to his neighbor, who, by the way, had also recorded everything he said. And then he spoke while the trial was going on, not in the trial, but while the trial was going on. He spoke after the trial. He spoke leading into the civil trial. He spoke. And most recently, he weighed in when there was another subway vigilante in New York City, Daniel Penny, who put a homeless street performer in a chokehold in front of everyone on a train and killed him. And so he has weighed in and explained his point of view so many times. I actually don't think there's a question I'd have.
Penny was the guy that ended up at the Army Navy game, I
Yeah.
think,
With
with
Trump, yeah. And I in that,
par for the course.
and I have to say, Chris, this is what I was trying to explain. Like, how in the world can we go from a country that, we have always had a long history of vigilante violence, particularly racialized violence, but there was a moment in American history where, particularly after the New Deal and into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when at least the cultural zeitgeist was the rule of law mattered. It's not that lynchings didn't happen, but and vigilante violence didn't happen, but it was kind of seen as uncivilized. You're supposed to take your complaints through the court system. And then all of a sudden, we ended up in this moment where the president of the United States is lauding the grotesque violence in places like Charlottesville, celebrating vigilantes like Kyle Rittenhouse, inviting vigilantes like Daniel Penny to have a leisure activity with him.
The one part in the story that I think creates the most tension is the other party involved in this story, which is the four boys.
Yeah.
And you pretty explicitly describe their plan or the events that were to take place that day, which is going from the South Bronx, and they wanted to, I think, pry open coins, I believe, from an arcade. And you intentionally do not soften that part of the story. Understanding that Bernie Gates, obviously a vigilante in this story. Why was it also important to be honest about what they were doing while also trying to weave in the humanity of the history for the boys there?
Well, because that's what happened. Again, I take us back to being a historian. How nice would it have been if they would have just been sitting there reading the newspaper and all of a sudden Bernie Getz got up and shot them? Like, how open and shut might that have been? No, this was a very complicated story in the sense that people were fearful. This was the 80s. This was a brutal time of Reagan era austerity. So the boys were feeling fearful of the police, fearful of no money, fearful of being hungry, fearful of no opportunity. Yes, I mean they're gonna do what they need to do, and no, they weren't becoming violent drug dealers, but they were going to engage in petty theft to get some money. And that whole landscape that leads them on that train mattered because it was the same landscape that Bernie Getz saw every day he left his apartment: the trash piling up, the lack of city services, the sense of dislocation and threat when you just walked down the street and it felt like everything was decaying and falling apart. And I wanted us to understand both of their senses of dislocation and fear and why getting on that train would be such a fraught experience. But what I also wanted to do, and this is the part where I think sometimes the nuance that you mentioned earlier, for some people it just seems like a bridge too far, really was that we needed to look at why this was happening. What is going on that an otherwise vibrant urban metropolis where people are becoming part of the middle class and buying homes and getting cool jobs and, the Big Apple, Gotham, it's so exciting to live. Like, what in the world is going on that this whole place feels like a hellscape? People are feeling so under siege. And it turns out, for those of you who are interested in the book, it turns out in ways that I didn't fully understand that this is a created crisis. It is created out of the desire of very, very wealthy people to stop paying into the broader social and public safety net that all Americans very much need to, send their kids to college, to get good jobs, to have stable housing. And this was a political changing moment, one that we're still living with, frankly, as we lurch even more into the Gilded Age of yesteryear. But on the ground, nobody knew exactly what was happening. And for guys like Bernie Getz, they particularly were being told what's happening here is not that rich people are getting richer. It's not that, the social fabric is fraying because there's no more money going into it. The reason why you're feeling so fearful is because there's a whole lot of thugs and animals and morally bankrupt people that prey on hardworking folks like you. And that messaging was so insidious. It was curated. It was crafted in the meanwhile newly rising conservative media ecosystem run by Rupert Murdoch, who, as we know, will then take that forward and create Fox News. And so for me, just writing it, and I think for some readers reading it, it was kind of a stunning gotcha moment in history where it's like, wow, this landscape that we have right now was carefully laid, paved the way for really the last 40 plus years. And so I call it in the book the long Reagan Revolution. But it is a revolution that every party is going to participate in. Bill Clinton is going to nail as many nails into that coffin as any of the rest of them. And the only difference with Trump is that he has just lifted the veil on it. He's like, we're not even
Hmm.
going to just call this dependency anymore, or we're not even going to just, use euphemisms like the welfare queen anymore. We're just going to go there.
Yeah, like it's like going to a puppet show and they're like, we're actually the puppets. You know what I
I
mean? Like
know.
we're the ones pulling the strings. And you talked about the media and the power of the media. And I have to wonder, when I had done a little bit of research on the book as I was reading it, Fox News and the New York Post had essentially in their own way turned Getz into a folk hero,
Oh,
right? Like a vigilante folk hero. And when you were doing your archival research, was there a moment where you were like, oh, okay, like this is how the media machine operates? Like this is how
yeah.
they're able to push this narrative at such a scale?
There were 2 moments that really I have to say, took me aback, and one of them was not so much of it the first was not so much of an archival document. I can't even really remember, I'd have to look at my own book, like, when this became clear to me, but it was when it became clear that the messaging in the Post, which was subtly anti-welfare, anti-liberal, anti-public sector, anti-anything smacking of government, but pro-vigilantism, take things into your own hands. When that message was going to come out in multiple editions in a day, so that when you're riding the subway, like there was always a new version, a new headline. So it was a way to make money and to really just pound the reading public. Because remember, this is before the internet. Pound the reading public with this messaging, and the deliberateness of it, I think that surprised me. But even more kind of Machiavellian behind the scenes, if you will, was the fact that I was in the Reagan Library doing research, and I find this kind of stunning document where Reagan insiders are, talking about the importance of messaging and how important it is that Reagan's messaging is getting out there and getting understood, and really getting understood the way that the Reagan Republicans wanted it to be understood, which was not
Yeah.
we are becoming richer, and not we are taking away your resources, but in fact that the problem was with government was liberal government, and the private sector is going to save us all.
Where have I heard that before?
They understood that Rupert Murdoch was their guy, and I was like, "What?" I mean, there's this exchange where they're basically like they're telling, inside the administration, they're like, "Look, you can't count on a lot of these other media outlets, but we can count on Rupert Murdoch. And for our foreign policy, we can count on him in the London Times and, in the Sun and around the globe, curate our foreign policy. So this is things like, eventually invading Grenada and, Star Wars and things like that. But domestically, it's explicit. We can count. This is the guy we need to count on in the New York Post, in the Boston Herald, and so forth, to essentially translate our message on the ground. And I thought, wow. And why does that matter? It matters because by the time we get to the 2016 election, and then the subsequent election for Trump, Fox News is the main purveyor of news in America for
Uh-huh.
everybody. It becomes the most important news source with the highest viewership of any other news mechanism. And that, again, took effort, took years to build, and was profoundly important, particularly as by 2024, that media has fully embraced misinformation, gets slapped with a 740 million, whatever it is, dollar settlement. I have to check my own book for that. For not telling the truth. And that amount of money is worth it. It's worth it because you just keep on doing it, and it's gonna change our history. It's gonna change political history.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And, one of the talking points in your book is, and very similar to Blood in the Water, and it's kind of like a recurring theme in your writing, I've noticed, is a lot of the stories that you tell from the historical perspective also weave this through line into the modern existence that we have today. When you think about the fear tactics that Reaganomics and also the current administration, like there's fear that is real, like fear that does actually exist, and then there's fear that is fabricated, which I believe you talk about pretty explicitly. And like, how do you weave together those truths,
Mm.
because they're both true in their own right, without cannibalizing one or the other?
Oh, what a great question. I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I guess again, it's where we go back to, are things supported and undergirded by fact, or aren't they? The fear of crime in by the, by 1984, that's real. Look at the data. We can quibble about what we mean by crime, but if we're just simply talking about simple things like assault and murder, and people sense that their personal safety is more in jeopardy, we can concretely say that people were in more jeopardy in 1984 than they were in other times. And we can concretely say that jobs are disappearing, which then just that amplifies the fear of scarcity. And we can say that the drug trade goes up in direct proportion to things like unemployment and the evaporation of public sector employment in particular. So those are fears, but they are ones that we not only can see the basis of, but we can explain the basis of. And then there are fears like every young Black boy is going to be a predator in New York City. These are fears that are deeply rooted in deep stereotypes. They are crafted, they're curated. And in fact, they are a fear that ignores the reality of the way crime really happens, particularly most frequently among intimates, same race intimates. And also that meanwhile, if you had far more to fear as a young Black teenager from a white member of law enforcement in this period and a random white fearful citizen in this period, then we have any way of really writing about or accounting for so far. Can we tether it to fact or not? And also, can we show that the media is deliberately, and this is the key word, deliberately writing narratives that they think will incite and sell? There's a really incredible book called, what is it called? It's a recent book on the New York Post. Wreckage is in its title. Why am I blanking on the name right now? But it's a really powerful book because it interviews all these Post reporters and really talks about the history of the New York Post. Fascinating to hear these reporters talk because they're basically like, look, one of them says, we never used to photograph Black people in these stories because they didn't photograph very well. Our tactic was, we had a really good tactic of, we would ask questions in such a way that we could write headlines that people would want to read. So, the one example I think I use in the book is they ask a police officer, what happens a given crime? And do you have any leads? Have you ruled out this? Have you ruled out that? And one of them was, have you ruled out a homosexual angle? And then the cop says, we haven't ruled out anything. Like we're just investigating. And the headline is, cops have not ruled out a homosexual angle on this crime. Okay, well, what does that
Yeah, it's just
immediately do to the reader? They're like, my God, this must be a homosexual crime.
yeah,
So
right. It's like
deliberate.
sensationalizing particular. Yeah. You talk about narratives, and one of the parts that I found particularly interesting was the way that you constructed the narrative around the jury trial. And, you had mentioned in the book, takeaway, I guess, of the jury's logic around this trial was, I believe the word you used was shocking.
Yeah.
Can you be specific about what was particularly shocking about the narrative that the jury constructed and kind of what that means in the greater scheme of kind of the theme of the book?
For good or ill, as readers of this book, you will be walked through this trial in quite a bit of detail. I mean, literally witness by witness. And, you're there in the jury box, you're there in the gallery watching this thing unfold. And there were myriad moments in the trial that were shocking because the judge allowed Bernie Goetz's very flashy lawyer, Barry Slott, to get away with stuff in the trial that, it was just kind of stunning, right? Because it including reenacting the entire thing in a way that never even happened. I mean, just moments where you're just like, huh, how did this even happen? And also the fact that there were so many people in the jury that were allowed to be on that had had previous crimes happen to them, muggings, including on the subway. I mean, just things that you're just thinking, what? However, the evidence presented in that trial was nevertheless so damning. And he was charged with attempted murder. He was charged with assault, and he was charged on weapons charges and reckless endangerment because, of course, she's shooting in a subway where there's passengers sitting mere feet away from the victims. And the evidence was not only was the preponderance of the evidence that he had done this, he had not felt he was being robbed, he had intended to kill them. He says that I had wanted to murder them all. If I would have had more bullets, I would have murdered them all. And you're watching the trial unfold. The jury is being handed a narrative by the defense lawyer that is preposterous, including that Bernie gets everything he said he did, that, by the way, was corroborated by eyewitnesses and the injuries of the victims, never happened. That this is what he wished he would have done. This is what he, in hindsight, what he hoped he would have done. That's the way he described it, to be more, bravado, da, da, da. It was stunning. And the jury not only buys the defense's argument, but I take you behind the scenes in the jury room, and it turns out, yeah, the jury instructions were messed up. There was lots of things legally happening that might have explained this, but really, they just come up with their own definitions of the law. One of the key jurors, one of the lead jurors, is just positing, well, this is what I think happened, and if this is what happened, then we can totally understand why he's arguing the case in the jury room based on stuff that was his own thing. And it was just so shocking.
And it just like goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, was like the ignorance of facts right in front of you. You know what I mean? It's just, even then.
And that up is down, down is up, backward, forward, like that you get so discombobulated by it all that the other jurors are kind of just like their head is spinning. One in particular, who's this English professor, and she's trying, like she's like, wait a minute, this is not what? And she's like holding out and holding out. And by the time they finish their deliberations, it's so bamboozled that everybody ends up collectively doing the wrong thing. And it was kind of a metaphor for where we are today, right? Not blaming individuals for where we are today, but to say, why wouldn't we be where we are? Because people have been lied to, they've been bamboozled. It's been a strategy that we didn't even know was going on. So actually, there's a lot of empathy, believe it or not, for people that actually did some pretty terrible things, because why wouldn't they have, given all that was coming at them?
It's an interesting time to be alive, for sure. It's like, it feels like every day is a new historical moment.
Yeah.
Looking back at the trial, to kind of wrap up the trial, is Getz, I believe, ended up sentenced to 1.5 years. I think only served 8.5 months.
Yeah.
On the flip side of that, Daryl Cabey ended up winning a civil judgment of like $43 million, of which I'm sure he never saw much of that money from Gates.
Well, that's part of that
So there's two
story. His mother just refuses to give up. So she's the heroine of this. And she does file a civil suit against Bernie Getz, which is another gripping trial that he does get slapped with a judgment, but he will pay not a single dime.
You have these two different verdicts, all part of the same story and the same different trials, obviously, but all part of the same event. I guess for someone, because especially nowadays, people are like, well, what's the right answer? In you being the one that wrote this narrative and constructed this story, which one, I guess, could you say tells the truth, maybe that needs to be told, or maybe just reveals the truth about a more overarching theme, which is the fractured American legal system?
Which trial? Which of the trials?
I guess maybe which of the outcomes tells more necessarily.
I think readers will come to the end of the book and really, I think, get a mixed message in a lot of ways, or maybe that's the wrong way to phrase it. But on the one hand, it is the criminal trial. It is what happens in the criminal trial and everything that happens in this case from start to finish that is such a blueprint for where we are today. And we go in slow motion to get there so that readers can really see, in a way that it just stunned me as even the writer of it, how deliberately curated and crafted it all was to get us where we are. On the other hand, the civil trial, at the end of the day, and the conclusions I make at the end of the book, suggests something I think pretty hopeful, which is that the thing about this whole crafted curation of this current moment of misinformation and real violence and real lack of empathy we have today is not stable. It is it needs constant work to keep it afloat. It needs constant stoking of misinformation to keep people destabilized enough to want to go there, to deny who they are by nature, which is, they love their kids, they
Hmm.
love their country, they love their neighbors, and somehow they become people who they are not. That takes effort. And we know it, as I say in the book, because there are moments even in this recent past when we've had a landslide of election of, say, Barack Obama, to say, no, we're going to push back at Wall Street. We're going to push back at killing of young boys like Trayvon Martin. We're going to push back at the prison system that has locked up so many poor people. We now see examples of that today. We see it with the election in New York City of Mamdani. We see it, the reaction to Minneapolis when Alex Preddy is gunned down and Renee Good is gunned down, that we actually do believe what we see with our eyes. We actually do
Hmm.
understand what's going on. And so, of course, to show how unstable this grip on us, hatred has, immediately, the country has to pivot. Now we're going to invade, now we're going to invade Iran. Now we're going to keep you unstable. But I'm hopeful, because at the end of the day, hatred and instability is, it's not putting food on people's tables. It's not making them secure. It's not allowing them to send their kids to college. So the civil trial has the biggest hope in it that, put the facts in front of ordinary people and give them some space to really understand them. And they're like, wait, what fever dream has this been? Let's grab back our country again. And I remain hopeful for that, even as every day feels deeply destabilizing still.
Yeah, no, that's such a great answer, and I appreciate the context there because I think it's super important. Two more questions for you here
Oh,
that I wanted to run by you. So, theme that I kind of noticed in both of the books is, while it is from a historian's perspective and you're telling a historical story, there also seems to be a theme that it could also read like a moral argument. Is that intentional, or is that kind of just how the story unfolds? Like, are you trying to tell a story about history while also weaving in the morality of that history and the current times? Or is that kind of just part of the process and how it ends up coming
Uh,
together?
I think you could probably get 5 historians in a room and we'd have so much to say about this. I think we could be accused. I think scholars in general can be accused, or are accused, I would say, of using the facts to support some kind of a moral argument, or amassing the past to proselytize about the future. The only reason I really push back on that, I mean, I think there's a place for people to speak to the morality of a given day and in a moment, but I actually don't think that that's what I'm trying to do. What I would say is that certain facts just are what they are. There are no two sides to enslaving other human beings prior to the Civil War, for example. We can make it complicated. We can offer you context for it. We can explain the economics of it. We can talk about how that produced cotton. We can talk about it in very complicated ways. But the fact of one group of human beings enslaving another group of human beings is a moral fact.
Right.
It just is. And so somewhere in there is what ends up coming out on the other end of the books that I write. So, if you at Attica, if you torture naked, unarmed men for days and weeks and subject them to the heinous things that the men in Attica were subjected to, this is not a moral question of what do you think about prisoner rights, or what do you think. It is pretty basic, right? That is a moral fact.
Right.
So in this book, cannot say that it is morally just to gun down somebody who you've never even spoken to on a train, such as Daryl Cabey, put a gun in his side, sever his spinal cord for the rest of his life, and not have those facts read in a moral way. But that doesn't
Right.
mean that I, as the historian, am trying to proselytize about what that is. I think it's pretty obvious to readers what that is. So I
Hmm.
don't know if that helps, but certain things just are what they are. What I try to do to mitigate if it's helpful, against that sense that this is all just this is what Heather thinks about, politics in the past, is the
Right.
context is super important. So I do want you to know how Bernie Getz grew up. And I do want you to know about the fear that people experienced on the streets of New York. And I do want you to understand that people are legitimately feeling dislocated in order for them to understand what Bernie Getz did and so forth. Context matters a lot. And I think context should always accompany facts, whether they are morally charged facts or not.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna get a banner of that. Context should always accompany fact. Like that
Mhm.
is just the that's what people need.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm really glad you said that. So to end things off here, somebody reads this book in a month or two and they're like, oh, okay. I have a much better understanding of what that event was during its own time and how we got here today. What do you want people to do with that understanding? Like where do you want them to go out into the world and take that understanding?
I think that just there's two answers, and one is more active perhaps and one is more passive. I don't know. The active is, of course, that anytime anyone tells you anything, I think we have an obligation to resist the sound bites, resist any messaging that makes us kind of go against our basic instincts, our basic humanitarian instincts. If someone is telling us to hate someone else, to suspect someone else, to fear someone else, I think we should all just, as human beings, say, well, let's just, huh? Like, who is that person I'm being told to hate? What is this context I'm being told to fear? So that's just kind of a more, I don't know, actively seeking what the information is behind the information. But I think there's something even just more basic, which is, and this sounds so moralistic to say, to end on this note, but I do think it's one that we all as human beings relate to, which is, how would you want your own circumstance to be understood? How would you want your own children treated? How would you want your own spouse treated? How would you want yourself to be treated and understood, including all the complexity that makes us up, and the worlds that we inhabit? And just simply pay that forward. And then, we
Yeah.
might just end up in a world where generosity rather than rage and violence can take us to a whole different history that has a whole different series of facts, which are no less moral, but maybe more positively moral than condemningly moral.
I think that's a fantastic answer. And obviously with the type of content that I create, I think obviously reading more books, one of the reasons I create content is I want more young men to
Yes.
stop listening to Joe Rogan's podcast and read more books and find empathy and exist in worlds that they otherwise wouldn't visit or be a part of. And so I think that's a
Oh, and
fantastic
and what
answer.
you do
So
is so important, because the thing about reading or
thank
listening to
you.
books, audiobooks or reading books, is that it's extraordinary what we don't know. I find this
Hmm.
every single day. Like, every time I pick up a book, I'm like, I had no idea whatever the thing is. And that's powerful, because suddenly all of a sudden you're like, I didn't know that this is whatever, like I'm reading about in Minneapolis. I didn't know that this is what, the Somali in Minnesota's experience. Like, you don't know everything. And books are such a beautiful way of broadening our perspective and our world and resisting misinformation and repelling racism and violence and all those terrible things.
Absolutely. So I always end my show with a pop-up question. I don't tell any of the guests what the question is. I
Okay.
kind of just come up with it during the interview. So you are a historian
Mhm.
and an author as well, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Congratulations. If at the end of your life you could have any historian write your life story, is there one person that you're like, that's who I want to tell my story? And what would it be called?
Oh my God. Oh, lordy, lordy, lordy. I don't know. I mean,
You're gonna have some historian friends be like, "I you didn't pick me?
no, I mean,
That's
actually,
kinda weird."
one of my favorite historians I would pick, and her name is Elizabeth Hinton. I would pick Elizabeth Hinton any day to write my story, should anyone care to read it. And I would trust her to not only excavate that story with all of its warts and its beauty marks, but also to, I don't know, I would trust her to come up with that title, because I actually don't know what the title would be. And in part, it's because of the way you just made the introduction and the way you described me. Like, you describe me one way, which is as a historian and a Pulitzer Prize winner. Like to me, I'm those things, but I'm also a mom of, 4
Mhm.
kids. I am an American citizen. I am a daughter. I am a sister. I am a lot of different things, and that right there is what the nation is. It's all of these things, and I would trust her with that context.
That's fantastic. So I appreciate the time. Thank you so much. I know you're so busy. You're actually in New York City now. I will leave a list of your upcoming tour dates. You can get Fear and Fury at the local bookstores online. You can get it wherever books are sold. I believe there's also an audiobook out.
Yes.
Heather Ann Thompson, thank you so much for hanging out and spending this time with us and answering some really great questions. I wish you the best on the rest of your tour. What are your next, I guess, kind of 2 or 3 upcoming tour
Well,
dates
I'm
that people
still in New
can
York
see?
City, so we're gonna do a place called Roosevelt House on the 25th, which is gonna be great with Elizabeth Hinton, actually, who I just shouted out,
Very
and
cool.
she's amazing. And what is next after that? I'm trying to think. I'm drawing a little bit of a blank, but I know I'm gonna be back in Detroit in April. I'm gonna be in Ann Arbor in April. I'm gonna be in Chicago in April. So yeah, just to keep it at it.
Awesome. So I will make sure to list the upcoming tour dates in the show description. Make sure you go read Fear and Fury. Also read Blood in the Water, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. I actually used about 40 annotation tabs in the first
My
20
goodness.
pages. I burned through 2 highlighters. So it's a fantastic book. Heather, thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me on.